Book 101 review. Book 101 is about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is a debut author and the author of the book Ring, a novel. No other than Miss Michelle Lerner. Welcome, Miss Michelle on Book 101 Review. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Sure. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me. My name's Michelle Lerner. I worked for a couple of decades as a public interest lawyer and was a poet. And I got very sick in 2016 and became disabled by chronic illness. And I started working slowly on what became my debut novel, which is Ring, a story that I'd had in the back of my mind for a couple of decades, but had never had the time or focus to be able to actually work on. And it came out this January, and it's with a small press. And surprisingly, because it's with a small press, it was just longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize, which is one of the biggest literary awards in the United States. So that's been a recent um, very surprising thing. And I have a memoir coming out next year.
And looking forward for that memoir, Miss Michelle, and we support you 100%. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And congratulations, hoping for more and more awards to come. The title ring is so evocative and open to interpretation. What is the central meaning of the ring in your story? Is it an object, a sound, a symbol, or a circle of people?
Well, on the most literal level, Ring is the name of a dog in the novel. Um, there's an echo that's making it a little hard for me to focus. Is that possible to
Okay,
stop, or is it?
yes, I will do it.
Uh, Thank you. Sorry. So on the most literal level, Ring is the name of the dog in the story. There's a dog on the cover. I'll explain a little bit about the plot and then more about the why I chose the name Ring. The story is about grief, complicated grief, which is grief that is very disabling and lasts a long time. And the plot of the story is that a middle-aged parent from the Midwest in the United States at the beginning of the story has lost their adult daughter and is grieving and having a very hard time going on. And one of the more common symptoms of complicated grief is that the person who's grieving feels like they can't go on with their own life because their loved one has died. And the main character in the story, Lee, feels that way and ends up going to a sanctuary in the Canadian subarctic in northern Ontario, that is for people who are terminally ill and want assistance with dying in a dignified way that involves walking out into the snow. And while at this sanctuary, the main character Lee meets this dog Ring, who a person who has brought there, who is terminally ill, has brought there and plans to take the dog on this walk with him, which will also end the dog's life. And um, the main character's concern over the fate of the dog ends up challenging their own perception of why they're there and what their own life means, like what it means to want to save the life of someone else when you're not trying to save your own life. And Ring is the name of the dog. Um, to me, the meaning, the reason that I chose that is there's a lot of practices at the sanctuary. One of them is meditation. And if you've ever done meditation practice, when there's long meditations, If it's a group meditation, often it'll start with the person leading the meditation ringing a small bell, and they'll sometimes ring it at different points in the meditation, and it's to sort of bring your awareness back to the present moment and to yourself. And the dog in this story serves that purpose to some extent for the main character. Daniel, I can't hear you if you're speaking.
Yes,
Oh,
interesting indeed, Miss Michelle. Interesting indeed. So, what is the initial seed, an image, a character, a question that grew into the world of this novel?
actually, years ago when I had a job and I was a legal aid lawyer in Boston, and I moved out of the city and had an hour and 45-minute commute each way, largely on a train. And I would spend some of the time that I was commuting sort of thinking of stories. And I had this was, probably more than 25 years ago, but I had this image of somebody in the snow walking towards a pillar, um, and coming across a dog. And I sort of from there figured out what the story was. And I don't know why I had that image or why it came to me. But the story then, I didn't sit down to actually try to write it until I think I started it in 2019. And at that point, I'd had a lot of things influence me in my life from my own experiences with grief, but also um, being severely ill with chronic illness. And while I was writing it, the lockdown for COVID started. And so I had experienced these various kinds of um, isolation that really fed into what became the story.
Miss Michelle, the word ring can imply a cycle or a loop. How does the concept of cycles of history, behavior, or relationships play out in your narrative?
A cycle? How does a cycle of relationships?
Yes, either the history, behavior, or relationship within the book itself, if you compare to a ring.
It's not something I've really thought of before, but the story a lot about isolation and the decision to come out of isolation. And I guess with the main character at the beginning, the main character had a life of connection with other people, but at the beginning of the book is very isolated, after the death of their daughter, sort of stopped engaging with everyone to the point that their spouse left, and they're alone and traveling to the sanctuary. And part of what the story is about learning in that state to reconnect with other people. And I guess that is a cycle of relationship, that the main characters, the book starts, I guess, midway through a cycle of connection to isolation to connection.
Miss Michelle, how did you discover about yourself or your own belief while writing this book? The ring.
Well, it's interesting. I was a poet before. I hadn't written fiction since I was in high school, probably. And part of why I hadn't written was lack of time and focus before I got sick. Um, but part of it, when I first wanted to write this, I didn't know how to start it or how I felt like I didn't know how to write the story within the conventional framework of a novel with chapters and a lot of backstory and a traditional story arc. And that made me feel like I didn't know how to write fiction or I didn't know how to write a novel and that I couldn't write it. And um, I picked up a book of essays by Susan Sontag, and one of the essays she talked, this was from the 1960s, and yet it seemed very, you know, radical to me and like an epiphany. She talked about how novelists had not developed um, and evolved in the same way as people in other arts, where, you know, with the abstract art and expressionism and impressionism, um, painters sort of slowly broke down every convention of painting from before and developed new rules or not having any rules. And poets had done this to some extent. And she was saying that novelists really didn't, and that a lot of what we think of as what a novel is actually just a historical accident of how what we consider a novel in Western literature developed, and that novelists should really feel free to and even feel encouraged to write without some of those conventions, to toss them out. And I finished that essay, and I think I opened my computer and started the novel at that point. And I wrote it, it's not in chapters, it's in vignettes. Some of them are very short. I initially wrote it without much backstory. I ended up weaving some in later. Um, I think the language is much more poetic than in much fiction. I focused on things like the arc of the story is very different than most than the kinds of story arcs in most fiction. To the extent that I didn't tell anybody I was even working on this, even my spouse, until I was halfway through, and I sent what I'd written to my poetry mentor, a woman who'd been mentoring me with poetry since I was 16, and I emailed it to her saying, "Does this count as a novel, and should I finish it?" And she stayed up all night reading it and wrote back, "It's really good. It counts as a novel. You absolutely need to finish it." At which point I started feeling like I was writing a book. And so a lot of what I discovered about myself in terms of being a writer from writing this was that I could write fiction, I could write a novel, and that I'm a bit, at least with fiction, a bit of an experimental and genre bending novelist, which is interesting because the poetry that I've written for decades, and I've published a lot of poetry. I have a poetry chapbook. I got an MFA in poetry, but I'm a narrative poet, and which is sort of an older style of writing poetry and not very experimental. And I went to an MFA program that was largely very avant-garde experimental poets, a lot of language poets, and I felt um, very non-experimental there, like a bit of a dinosaur. And so it was very interesting to me that when I started writing fiction, what I was writing was considered very experimental.
And it totally works, Miss Michelle, because you won an
No,
award.
the the award that I was talking about, Aspen Words
Mm-hmm.
Literary Prize, I've been longlisted with 14 other books for it. The fi-
Okay.
the finalists will be determined in March. But I cannot express enough how stunned and
Gratitude you
happy I
have.
am just to be longlisted. I mean, the
Yes.
authors, it's mostly, you know, very large presses, Penguin, Random House. The other authors on this long list are amazing. One just won the National Book Award. I think two others were finalists for the National Book Award in the United States. They're New York Times bestsellers. They're on Oprah's book club.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in very good company. To me, being on the long list is like winning an award. But I do not want to.
Yes.
But I don't want to give the impression that it has won that award. It has not won that award. That award has not even been decided yet.
But as you said, on the list is something else. We will sure you're gonna win. You will win, Miss Michelle. Just
I already feel
material.
like I've won.
Yeah, yes, materialize it.
No, I
And
mean, I feel like being on the long list for me, that
yes,
is beyond something that I was ever expecting.
an achievement indeed. Without giving away spoilers, what is the central emotional or moral dilemma your protagonist faces, and what make it so compelling to you?
The essential dilemma that the main character Lee faces is whether to continue their life or not, um, and what makes life worth living. And especially in the face of wanting to rescue someone else or take care of someone else, what does it mean to want to save another person or being when you don't want to save yourself? Um, I'm I'm hearing the echo again, which is, yeah, thank you. Um, so yes, that's the sort of the main um, conflict in the book. I think, and part of what makes it compelling to me is I think a lot of people struggle with grief, with depression. I think I've read that in the United States alone, I think over 1 million people each year struggle with complicated grief, which is very long-term disabling grief. And I think a lot of what people expect and what's depicted in a lot of, at least American literature and movies, when somebody is struggling with grief or depression, is that there's this sudden, by the end of the book, by the end of the movie, by the end of a couple of months in real life, there's a resolution to the grief where somebody sort of gets past it or gets over it and is able to be happy again. And the reality, especially when it's a traumatic loss or somebody very close to you, or if somebody's just struggling with severe depression, is that it it may not it is likely to not actually resolve. And the question is, how do you go on living without it resolving? How do you live with grief? How do you live with depression? How do you live knowing that you'll never see someone again who was very important to you? Maybe somebody who died young and you feel like should have outlived you. And that's the central question of the book. Like, what does it take to be able to go on living anyway? And how does one shape the rest of their life with that level of disorientation?
Miss Michelle, as a debut author, what are your short term and long term goals?
Well, I have a second book coming out next year with the same press. It's very different. It's also to some extent or about human animal connection, like Ring is, but it's nonfiction. Part of the time that I was a lawyer, I was a legal aid lawyer, but part of the time I did animal law and I run a cat rescue, and I've had a lot of unusual animals in my life. And the memoir is called A Series of Opinionated Animals, and it's um, it's kind of a it's kind of a memoir, but I'm not actually the main character. The animals are the main characters. I'm sort of a secondary character in it, and it's largely humorous. It's very different than Ring, which is extremely serious. Although there's some level of absurdist humor in Ring also. Um, my long-term goals with writing is I would like to keep writing. I've started a historical novel, which I've had trouble focusing on writing between my illness and other obligations, but I'm still um, I'm still promoting Ring, and I'm going through the process of getting the second book out, and working on in various ways on 3 books at a time is a little bit challenging, although I know a lot of authors do it. But certainly my long-term goal is to keep writing and to keep publishing.
Good luck to your goals, Miss Michelle. I'm looking forward for more success. And what will be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be an author like you?
First of all, you just need to start writing, um, and write what write what comes to you without worrying about how it fits into the conventions of what you expect something should look like. Um, Part of why I started writing was that I read that essay by Susan Sontag that convinced me that I could write something even if I couldn't fit it within the chapter and 3 act and narrative arc structure that I thought all novels needed to follow. But part of it was that I was sick, and one of the practitioners that I was seeing encouraged me to just start writing something every day. And he meant journaling, that, journaling can help with dealing with symptoms of illness. Um, but instead of journaling, I just started writing what became this novel. And because I wrote it in these vignettes, I often wrote for 15, 20, 30 minutes a day, maybe an hour at most, and sort of slowly wrote the book. So my advice is to not keep telling yourself, I can only start writing when I have the time to sit down for 5 hours a day and write. I can only write when I can envision this book perfectly in a way that matches how I understand other books to be. Just start writing what makes sense to you and see where it goes.
Miss Michelle, thank you for that advice. And can you please recommend a book or books that influence your journey?
Well, um, part of the reason I wanted to write this book was that when I was dealing with grief when I was much younger and I looked for books that would help me, I didn't find a lot of nonfiction, sort of self-help books that were very helpful. What I found that helped me were two books that were written in the first person, that were stories, in the first person about somebody going through serious and complicated grief. And one was, and they really helped me a lot. And it felt like the characters or the narrators were reaching out a hand to me. And one of them was called A Grief Observed, and it's a memoir by C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia series. After his wife died, he started keeping a journal of his grief and his experience mourning her. And this book is he started at the beginning of a journal, and when he got to the end of the notebook, he stopped writing, and that's what the book is. And it was very powerful, and it helped me a lot. And the other is a novella called Kitchen by the Japanese author Banana Yoshimoto. And it's fiction, but it's first person. It's about grief. It's very compelling, and actually, all of her novels are about grief, and I find them all really compelling. I've read every book by Banana Yoshimoto that's been translated into English, and she's very prolific. I really highly recommend her work.
Highly recommended, and thank you so much, Miss Michelle, for that recommended books. And before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, because we wrap up the podcast. My abstract essay is already in fifth season. Abstract poetry in second season. I'm a book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 in third season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101, love letters, movie 101 review, music 101 our fourth season, science 101, sex 101 in eighth. Second season of my baby podcast, Law 101, Mental Health 101, and Bible Verses 101. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Miss Michelle, what is the question about ring that you wish someone would ask, but no one ever has?
Hmm. You may actually have asked it in asking me what the significance of the word ring is, or the title ring, because it is something that's very symbolic and that I thought would be very obvious, but I think out of everyone who's reviewed it, I think only one person actually seemed to realize that. And most of the people who I've heard from who've read the book didn't either. So I actually appreciate you asking that.
Miss Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Hoping for more and more empowering books like this to come, and looking forward for your memoir. And please do come over on Book 101 Review and let's talk about it. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your book, the book reading.
I'm
Michelle,
sorry.
Michelle, can you please invite our listeners to support your book? Am I apologies? We have a having a
There was
glitch.
there was a sound issue. Are you asking where the book is available?
Yes, please. Can you please invite our listeners to support your book? My
Sure.
apologies. We have a having a glitch, people. We're having a glitch.
Sure.
So please, Miss
Yeah.
Michelle.
Ring is available on bookshop.org in many bookstores and libraries. It's also available on Amazon in paperback, Kindle version, and audiobook. But for people who are in the US, possibly Canada, and can support, bookshop.org, or I think Indigo in Canada, and are looking for the paperback, I highly support doing that over Amazon.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Michelle Lerner because if you support her for sure, more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Miss Michelle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Welcome, people. See you soon.